Hello everybody and welcome back to the Fortress of Solitude. Today we're going to be checking out My Adventures with Superman issue 2 by J.C. Campbell, Pablo M. Collar and Nick Filardi. Superman and his friends continue to investigate the reappearance of the Amazotech and the military led by Bloodsport who took it. Superman however sits this one out as the military took the tech to Mount Simonson, a special base that has anti-Kryptonian technology protecting it. So it's up to Clark Kent, Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen to enter as reporters, thanks to Lois's military connections. I quite like that the book isn't shying away from focusing on stuff other than Superman. You know, being that this is a comic, you would think that it would be the easy way to just fill every page with Superman action, you know, explosions, big battles with villains and everything. Stuff they probably couldn't do on an animated show's budget. Something you can just kind of get away with in comics because it's a lot cheaper. But I like that they aren't doing that at all, and Campbell keeps everything consistent with what we've seen on the show, where we get good amounts of character development, diving into the investigative journalist side of the story. Clark and the others get into the base on the pretense that they are covering Metropolis's history and the base's historic values to the city. Unfortunately for Jimmy, he's banned from the base thanks to his Flamebird videos trying to expose the site's UFOs and evil Atlantean mermaid army. Of course, none of which is particularly true, but I kind of like that they are just banning him on the pretense that maybe it is true, and I do like that there's a hint there of like Aquaman related stuff with the Atlantean army. Luckily, with Jimmy not being let in, he ends up overhearing a conversation between Slade Wilson and Bloodsport, who are busy taking verbal shots at one another in a nearby hallway. I love the cattiness between these two professionals who obviously have a history with one another and with Task Force X and Checkmate. Bloodsport also hints at more of the overarching story with this Amazo and with Checkmate, and how Waller lost Nemesis Omega, which was the robotic Kryptonian who invaded Earth with that ghost ship at the end of season 1. Makes me wonder if maybe this Amazo is related to that in some point, and maybe it's some sort of rogue Kryptonian technology and not Amazo technology. I'm hoping Bloodsport also makes a jump to animation in season 3 of the show, since having him as a foil for Slade is great, and actually gives Slade something to focus on and not just kind of, you know, stand beside Waller and kind of look cool and, you know, have a cool fight scene every now and then. It actually gives him a bit of a story to follow with him having to compete with this other guy on this warring faction. Clark and Lois, meanwhile, are led deep into the facility on their tour, and Clark is suddenly overcome by a piercing sound thanks to the red sun field messing up with his powers. So every now and then his powers kind of kick in overdrive when they've come flooding back, and it allowed him to hear the Amazo robot screaming in pain from behind a DNA locked door. Luckily, thanks to Lois's never back down attitude and a little bit of luck, the duo are able to get past the DNA locked door thanks to Lois's DNA, being that she would share DNA with her father, who was on file on the base's computer. So now look, I know it's a comic and it's a comic of a cartoon as well, but this is a little out there in terms of believability. Like, this feels a little bit too convenient, and I don't know, you got to push the story forward, but surely there would have been a better way than, oh, Lois just knows her DNA would work, just like how her father's would work. I know it kind of fits with the show's shtick, and like stuff like this would happen in the show all the time, but it just kind of took me out of it a little bit. After bypassing the lock and descending down into the basement of the base, they find Dr. Thaddeus Kilgrave experimenting on the alien tech. Kilgrave is a running Superman villain that I don't think gets quite used enough or given enough attention. He did appear briefly in Superman and Lois in the live action show, which I greatly appreciated, but I like that he's been brought back here for this, since he's very much overlooked because he does have that mad professor shtick about him, and lots of other Superman villains have that shtick as well, so why use him when you could use someone like Toyman or, you know, Prankster, you know, someone who also fits that bill. But I like the comic for actually doing this, and JC for actually bringing this villain back. He's a fun little guy, and hopefully we see more of him as the book continues. Before Clark can stop the Doctor and Jimmy can find his friends, Slade, who planted bombs around the base, sets them off, destroying much of the facility and leading to him and Bloodsport to get into a fight. I love the idea of only getting to see the beginning of this fight before we return to Clark and Lois' story, since again, it would have been so easy to just fill the back half of this issue with just all this action between Slade and Bloodsport, but I like that they don't do that, and it's just still great character work from here on in. Clark meanwhile tries to help out the in-pain Amazo even without his powers fully working. Pablo N. Collar and Nick Filardi's art continues to capture the energy of the show perfectly while also making the art its own thing. Small bursts of action we saw just before with Bloodsport and Slade getting into it were really cool, but I do like that it does focus on the character moments more, and both Pablo and Nick excel at those things as well. We get great little moments between Lois and Clark throughout this issue which are just fantastic and things you would see in the show all the time as well. Back with the story, Jimmy meanwhile helps get out some injured soldiers as it's revealed that more bombs have been placed around the base as well. Jimmy gets an idea and grabs one of the bombs and tosses it at the Red Sun generator, causing it to blow up and give Clark his powers back fully, but before he can fully get them, the Amazo is freed and forced to fight Slade on Bloodsport's commands. However, he fights back against his control and in doing so causes him to go on a violent rampage. The mystery of the Amazo is also really interesting since, as I said before, it might be also tied in with all of this Nemesis, Omega, Kryptonian stuff we saw in the first season, and it appears this Amazo has a sentience of its own, like it's got its own mind and memories. However, it is being forced into doing terrible things that it does not want to do, something completely different from the Amazos we've seen in the show so far. Clark wanting to help the being first and foremost is great as well, and he doesn't see it as a villain, just a person in pain which has been dealt upon it by Task Force X, which has been a running thing in the first season of the show, where most of Clark's villains that he fought throughout that show, or pretty much every one of them, was related to Task Force X in some way. They got their powers via experimentations or being forced to work for Task Force X in some sort of way. So it's cool to see the next step of that in this comic. Clark now has his powers back, so he ends up getting Jimmy and Lois to safety before returning to aid the Amazo, grabbing the being and preventing him from going on an unwarranted rampage. Clark uses the Amazo's power siphon abilities to his advantage though, forcing the Amazo to take all of his powers, which overloads his systems, causing a reset in the control that Bloodsport had over him, causing him to sort of calm down a little bit more. The superpowered Amazo manages to escape, but without his powers, Clark is left to be captured by Bloodsport, who wants to try him for treason. I really loved this ending, and since I love that we didn't get Superman at all in this issue, it would have been so easy for Superman just to suddenly appear, you know, Clark's changed into Superman, but Clark didn't. Clark came at this Amazo as Clark. He helped the being as Clark, and I have to wonder if whether that's going to factor into anything, since technically this Amazo is now free, it has its own mind, it just saw Clark give all his powers to him, so it can kind of probably work out that Clark Kent is Superman, or at least a powered individual, so how will it react to that? And I'm really intrigued to see that in the coming issues, since it's really interesting that Clark is the one being, you know, the hero in all of this, and Superman not being in it really at all. Superman's in, I think, one panel throughout this entire issue, which is really interesting to me, since Clark didn't need the costume to be the hero this time round. My adventures with Superman's comic adventures continue to do a great job expanding the world of the animated show, greatly focusing on the character moments rather than bombastic, flashy action a cartoon budget might not allow. The story Campbell is constructing with the Rogue Amazo is interesting, and I can't wait to see where she takes it next. I'm going to give this issue a 9 out of 10.